We begin, as we always do, with a plain truth. At 41 years old, Clara Whitfield had exactly $34, one gray mule, and no home to call her own. She had been cast out of her own ranch by Ezra Whitfield, her late husband's brother, who produced a deed she had never seen and a lawyer who smiled the whole time he read it aloud. He told her, not unkindly, that a widow with no papers to her name had no claim to anything with his family's name on it, and then he watched from the porch while she loaded her life into a wagon that groaned under the weight of far too little. With what remained of her savings, she did something the whole town of Cabazon, New Mexico territory, thought was proof that grief had finally taken her mind entirely. She walked into the county land auction and paid $12 for a quarter-acre of cracked earth and a boarded-up well that every soul for 40 miles called cursed. They said the water in it had gone bad the year it was dug, that men who drank from it sickened, that livestock refused to go near the rim, and that whoever owned it would inherit nothing but bad luck. Clara bought it anyway, with hands that trembled only a little, because something in the dry, sun-bleached timbers of that well spoke to a part of her nobody else could see. She did not know yet that beneath that condemned stone lay a secret sealed away for 26 years, one that would not only overturn everything she had lost, but would return to an entire town the one thing it had been quietly starved of for a generation. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Clara Whitfield. If you're watching this from a town that other people have written off, or from a home that looks like nothing much from the road, tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Clara had not always been a woman with empty hands. She had been raised on the edge of the Sangre de Cristo foothills by a father named Amos Doyle, a stonemason and well digger whose reputation traveled farther than his wagon ever did, because in a land where water was scarcer than gold, a man who could find it honestly was worth more than any prospector. Amos taught his only daughter everything he knew, not because he lacked sons, but because Clara was the one who listened, the one who crouched beside him in the red dust with her ear pressed near to the ground as if the earth itself might whisper to her if she was patient enough. He taught her to read the color of soil the way other people read a letter, to notice where certain grasses grew thick and green even in a drought, to understand that limestone held water differently than granite, that a willow rarely lied about what ran beneath it. He taught her, too, that water belonged to no man, that it was the one true wealth that could not be hoarded without eventually punishing the hoarder, because thirst has never once in the history of the world respected a fence line. Clara grew into a woman who could set a stone true, who could tell by the sound of a dropped pebble how deep a shaft ran, who could smell iron and sulfur and alkali in water before it ever touched her tongue. It was, her father always said, a strange inheritance for a daughter, more useful than lace and less decorative than piano lessons, but he never once apologized for giving it to her. She married Thomas Whitfield when she was 23, a rancher with kind eyes and a laugh that carried across pastures, and for 18 years they built something together on land east of Cabazon that was neither grand nor easy, but was entirely theirs. Thomas trusted his younger brother Ezra with the parts of the business that involved paperwork and banks, because Thomas himself had never taken to letters and numbers the way Clara had taken stone and water, and because family, in those years, still meant something worth trusting. Clara kept her father's skills alive in small ways during that time, walking the property to point out where a new well should be sunk, helping neighbors find water on land that other diviners had given up on, quietly building a reputation of her own, even as she remained, in the town's eyes, simply Thomas Whitfield's wife. She never imagined she would need that reputation to survive. She never imagined, in those years of sun and cattle and modest plenty, that the ground beneath her own life could shift as suddenly and completely as the ground beneath a poorly built well. Thomas died in the spring of 1889, thrown from a spook horse during a hailstorm that came down out of a sky that had been perfectly clear an hour before, and Clara buried him on a hill overlooking the ranch he had built with his own two hands, the ranch she had believed, until that very week, would always be a roof over her head. She learned, 3 days after the funeral, that Thomas had never formally recorded a deed transfer he'd promised her years before, a piece of paperwork he had always meant to finish and never had, the kind of small, unfinished business that ordinary happiness allows a person to postpone forever. Ezra, who had handled the family's legal affairs for a decade, produced an older document instead, one naming himself and Thomas as joint owners with rights of survivorship, a paper Clara had never seen and had no memory of her husband mentioning. Whether it was legitimate or manufactured in grief's shadow, Clara never fully learned, because Ezra had money enough for lawyers and she did not, and in the New Mexico territory of 1889, a widow's word carried the weight of a rumor next to a signed document. Within 2 months, she was gone from the only home she had known as a married woman, and within 3, she stood at the Cabazon land office with the last of her savings folded into a handkerchief, watching an auctioneer sell off delinquent and abandoned parcels to men who barely glanced at the papers before bidding. Most of the parcels went for reasonable sums, land with good grazing or a working spring fetching $30 or $40 from ranchers looking to expand. But when the auctioneer called out the quarter-acre, known locally as the Hornado Well, a ripple of low laughter moved through the crowd, and several men made the sign against evil that old Spanish families still used without quite believing in it anymore. The well had been dug in 1863. The story went by men working for the town's founding family, the Brooms, and within a year of its completion, 3 men who drank from it had sickened and 1 had died, and ever since it had sat capped and abandoned a mile outside town, its wooden cover gray and split, its rope rotted to threads, its rim overgrown with the kind of hardy, ugly brush that grows where nothing good is expected to grow. No one wanted cursed water. No one wanted cursed land. When the auctioneer, more out of duty than hope, asked for an opening bid, Clara heard her own voice before she had entirely decided to speak, and she said $12, and no one bid against her, and the gavel came down on laughter she pretended not to hear. She walked the mile out to the well the following morning with a lantern, a crowbar, and the particular calm of a woman who has already lost everything a curse could possibly threaten. The boards over the wellhead had warped and splintered with a quarter-century of sun, and it took her the better part of an hour to pry them loose, sending down a shower of dust and dead insects that made her cough and step back, laughing despite herself at the absurdity of what she was doing. When the opening finally stood clear, she knelt at the rim and lowered the lantern on a length of new rope she'd bought with almost the last of her money, and what she saw did not look cursed to her at all. The shaft was deep, deeper than most wells in that country, lined with stonework far more careful than a simple ranch well would require, the kind of precise, patient masonry her own father would have admired and remarked upon. She could see no standing water from that height, only the dark throat of the shaft descending into cool shadow, but she caught, even from that distance, a mineral smell rising up that was sharp and strange, not the rotten egg stench of true alkali poisoning, but something closer to lime and old iron, the smell, she thought with a prickle at the back of her neck, of water that had simply been made to seem bad rather than water that actually was. It took her 3 days of careful, solitary work to clear enough debris from the upper shaft to lower herself partway down on a rigged harness of rope and old ranch tack. And on the 3rd day, wedged into a stone recess perhaps 20 feet below the surface, her fingers found something that was not stone at all. It was a small ledge built deliberately into the wellhead's construction, invisible from above, and set into that ledge was a copper box no larger than a Bible, sealed with wax long gone, brittle and green with age. Her hands shook as she worked it free, and she climbed back to the surface faster than she had ever climbed anything in her life, sitting in the dust beside the well with the box in her lap for a long while before she found the nerve to open it. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth that had kept the contents remarkably dry, she found a leather-bound ledger, a folded map inked in a careful surveyor's hand, and a bundle of letters tied with wax string, all of it bearing the name of a man Clara had never heard spoken in Cabazon, Tobias Argyle, surveyor and partner to Silas Broom, the very man whose family had founded the town and whose grandson Cornelius Broom now owned nearly every working well and water right for 20 miles in every direction. The ledger's first pages were dry, technical records of surveying work depths and soil compositions, and the ordinary business of a man paid to find water in a hard country. But as Clara turned the brittle pages by lantern light that night in the small rented room she'd been sleeping in above the mercantile, the entries began to change in tone, becoming less a record of labor and more a record of conscience wrestling with itself. And by the time she reached the entries from the autumn of 1863, she understood that she was holding something far larger than a ledger. She was holding the reason an entire town had been thirsty for 26 years. Tobias Argyle's later entries described, in increasingly troubled language, how the well at the Jornada site had struck what he called the finest vein of water he had encountered in a decade of surveying the territory. A deep, clean aquifer that would have supplied the entire growing settlement with more water than its modest wells combined ever could. But Silas Broom, Argyle wrote with evident shame, had seen in that discovery not a gift for the town, but a threat to a business he had already quietly begun building, a network of smaller, inferior wells he owned outright and intended to sell water from at whatever price desperate ranchers and homesteaders would pay. A well that, good, freely available, would have ruined that business before it began. So Broom had ordered the well capped rather than opened, had paid 3 men to fall convincingly ill after drinking from a barrel dosed with enough alkali salt to sicken but not kill, had let one unfortunate man's unrelated death from cholera that same season be blamed on the well instead, and had spent the years since quietly reinforcing the story of a curse, letting superstition do what threats and lawsuits might not have accomplished nearly so cleanly. Argyle's final entry, dated the spring of 1864, recorded his intention to bring the matter before the Territorial Land Office, and his fear that Broom, upon learning of this intention, might do something drastic to prevent it. There was no entry after that. Clara searched the letters for any record of what became of Tobias Argyle, and found only a single, and signed note tucked into the very back of the box, in a different hand than the ledger, stating simply that the surveyor had left the territory suddenly and had not been heard from since, and that his belongings had been quietly disposed of by Silas Broom himself, who had generously offered to settle the departed man's outstanding debts. Clara sat with that ledger open on her knees until the lantern burned low, and she understood, with a clarity that felt almost physically heavy, exactly what she was holding. She was holding proof that the town's water scarcity, the very scarcity that had kept ranch families scraping by on inferior wells for a generation and had made the Broom family wealthy and powerful in the process, had been manufactured rather than natural. She was holding proof that could unravel the Broom Water Company entirely, could free every family in Cabazon from the water prices Cornelius Broom set as he pleased, and could, not incidentally, restore some measure of justice to a surveyor who might have paid for his conscience with far more than his career. And she was holding it as a woman with no standing left in the town, no husband, no ranch, no lawyer, and a name that most people now associated more with foolishness than with truth. Word travels fast in a small territory town, and word that the widow Whitfield had bought the cursed well and was seen climbing down into it with rope and lantern traveled faster than most. Within a week, Cornelius Broom himself rode out to the Jornada site, a broad, unhurried man in a good coat who had inherited his grandfather's business since along with his name, and he found Clara at the wellhead with sleeves rolled and hands raw from rope work, and he offered, with the easy generosity of a man who expects to be thanked, to buy the parcel back from her for $50, more than 4 times what she had paid. Clara understood in that moment, watching the practiced patience behind his smile, that he did not yet know what she had found, only that a woman digging seriously into supposedly cursed, worthless land made him uneasy in a way he could not entirely name, and that unease alone was worth $50 to him. She thanked him and declined, and watched something harden behind his eyes before he tipped his hat and rode away, and she understood without being told that the offer would not be repeated, and that whatever came next from Cornelius Broom would not be generous. It began as these things often do with talk. Within days, new rumors moved through Cabazon alongside the old ones. Rumors that the widow Whitfield had gone strange with grief, that she'd been seen talking to herself at the well, That disturbing accursed place would bring the same sickness down on the whole town that had struck it a generation before. Clara bore this with the particular patience of a woman who had already survived losing far more than her reputation. But patience alone did not fill the well's shaft with clear water, and she knew that proving Tobias Argyle's ledger true would require more than old paper. It would require opening the well fully and drawing water the whole town could see and taste for itself. And that meant weeks of labor she could not do entirely alone. She found, unexpectedly, help in a widower named Julio Vasquez, whose family had ranched near Cabazon for 3 generations and who remembered, better than most, his own grandfather's bitter stories of paying broom prices for broom water while a cursed well sat capped a mile from land that could have used it freely. Julio brought his sons and his tools, and slowly, quietly, others came too, families who had grown tired enough of the water company's prices to risk a little ridicule on the chance the widow was onto something real, and by late summer a rough crew of a dozen people worked the Jornada site most days, clearing stone, reinforcing the old shaft's walls, and rigging a proper windlass over the wellhead. Cornelius Broom did not sit idle while this happened. He complained to the county that Clara's crew was working without proper permits, and though the complaint went nowhere, it cost her precious days answering questions of the land office. He let it be known, through channels quiet enough to avoid direct accusation, that any family helping at the cursed well might find their existing water contracts with his company reviewed for renewal. 2 families pulled their help after that, apologizing to Clara with genuine regret in their eyes, and she told them, meaning it, that she understood entirely and held no grudge, because she knew better than anyone what it cost to be without water in that country. He tried, too, a subtler tactic, sending a surveyor of his own to quietly examine county records and argue before the land office that the original 1863 parcel boundary had been improperly recorded, that the well itself might legally belong to an adjoining tract his family had held continuously since that year. It was a claim built on nothing but old paper and older money, but it threatened for several tense weeks to tie the whole matter up in the territorial courts for a year or more, time enough for the well to sit idle again and for the town's thirst for the truth to cool the way most curiosities eventually do. It was Clara's own father's training, more than any lawyer's argument, that broke the deadlock in the end. She remembered Amos Doyle telling her once that the truest proof of a well's history was rarely found in an office full of paper, but in the ground itself, in the particular character of the stonework, the layered deposits along the shaft walls, the way certain minerals told a story that no forged deed could contradict. She invited the land commissioner himself, a cautious, weathered man named Otis Pruitt who had held his post since before the well was capped, to come see the site firsthand, and she walked him down partway on the newly rigged harness, showing him the careful surveyor's stonework Tobias Argyle himself had overseen, work that matched, stone for stone and technique for technique, other confirmed Argyle projects listed in county records from that same year, work that could not possibly belong to whatever unnamed party broom surveyor claimed had built it. She showed him, too, the copper box and its contents, and watched Pruitt's face change as he read the ledger's later entries in the fading afternoon light, his expression moving slowly from professional caution into something more troubled and more human. He told her plainly, before he rode back to town, that he could not promise how the matter would resolve in official terms, but that he had never in 30 years of land dispute seen evidence quite so damning, and that he intended to see it read into the county record himself. The well came fully clear in the first week of September, and Clara was the one who lowered the bucket for the final time and drew it up before the whole gathered crowd. Dozens of people who had come out from Cabazon on foot and on horseback once word spread that the widow's crew had struck water at last. She poured a cup for herself first, not from bravado, but because she would not ask another soul to risk what she had never once truly doubted, and she drank it down in front of everyone. Cool and clean and faintly sweet with lime, water finer than anything the broom company had sold the town in a generation. There was a long silence after that, the particular silence of a crowd realizing all at once that something they had believed for half their lives had been a lie. And then Julio Vasquez stepped forward and drank a cup of his own, and then his sons, and then, one by one, nearly everyone present, until the well that had sat cursed and capped for 26 years was surrounded by a town drinking freely from it, laughing in the strange, relieved way people laugh when a fear they've carried along. Time is finally, undeniably lifted. Cornelius Broom did not come to the well that day, and he did not need to, because Otis Pruitt had already carried Tobias Argyle's ledger into the Territorial Land Office and had it entered formally into the county record, alongside sworn statements from two elderly residents who, once the truth was finally spoken aloud, admitted they had always privately doubted the curse story and had simply never had cause or courage to say so. The revelation did not ruin Cornelius Broom in the dramatic way that such stories sometimes end, with public disgrace and a hasty departure from the territory. He was, after all, a businessman who understood which way public sentiment had turned, and rather than fight a battle he now stood no chance of winning, he did something that surprised the town nearly as much as the well's water had. He quietly began negotiating to sell his water company's assets and remaining wells to a cooperative the town itself would own and govern at a fair price rather than an extortionate one, and he left, within the year, for territory further west, where his family name carried no particular weight and no particular shame either. Clara never learned whether he left from guilt or simple pragmatism, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she did not much care which it was, because either way, the town got its water back, and Ezra Whitfield, watching from the edges of a community whose good opinion had begun turning decisively toward the sister-in-law he'd cast out, found his own reputation quietly, permanently diminished, invited to fewer tables, and trusted with fewer signatures than before, which was, in its own patient way, as much justice as Clara ever asked the world to deliver. We began this story with a woman of 41, cast out with almost nothing, who spent $12 desperate on a well the whole territory called cursed. We told you then that something sealed inside it would change her life and restore community, and now you know what that something was. Not gold, not silver, but the truth about water itself, hidden away by a man who valued his own fortune above an entire town's thirst, and uncovered by a woman whose only real inheritance had been the patient, unglamorous skill of listening to what the ground was trying to say. Clara Whitfield never became a wealthy woman in the years that followed because she asked for no share of the cooperative's profits beyond what her labor had earned, and she never reclaimed the ranch Ezra had taken because by then she had built something she valued more, a small stone house near the well itself, where travelers passing through Cabazones still stopped sometimes to draw water and hear the story of the well that was never cursed at all, only stolen from the people who needed it most. What she did with a discovery that could have made her rich was, in the end, the truest measure of the values her father had planted in her as a girl kneeling beside him in the red dust. That water belongs to no one man. That patience outlasts a lie no matter how old it grows, and that the things the world calls worthless are very often only waiting for someone willing to look closely enough to see otherwise. Thank you for spending this evening with Clara Whitfield and the town she helped bring back to life. If her story moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who needs a reminder that overlooked things are not always worthless things, and that the truth, like water, has a way of finding its level no matter how long it's kept underground. Before you go, we'd love to know, has there ever been a time in your own life when you found real value in something everyone else had already written off? Tell us in the comments below. We read every one. Until next time, stay close.